Pregnant again? How utterly disappointing. Marla's words sliced through the tense silence like a butcher's knife. My stomach dropped as I slowly looked up from my plate at my mother-in-law's sneering face. Evan shifted uncomfortably beside me, but stayed silent as usual. Marla continued, her voice dripping with disdain. Another daughter, I assume? When are you going to give my son the heir he deserves? I felt the blood drain from my face as the weight of her words slammed into me. This was supposed to be a joyful celebration dinner for my pregnancy, but Marla had once again managed to turn it into a humiliation. Mother, please, Evan finally muttered, but she waved him off dismissively. Don't mother me. You're just as frustratingly submissive as your father was. If you don't control your wife, she'll keep popping out these disappointing female placeholders. Tears stung my eyes as I finally found my voice. Zoe is not a placeholder. She's our beloved daughter, and this pregnancy is still early. We don't know the sex yet. Oh, spare me. Marla rolled her eyes. With your atrocious track record, it's clearly another girl. You're a broodmare failure. The venom in her tone shook me to my core. Evan's head hung low, crushed by his mother's verbal lashing. Hurt and rage burned inside me, but I knew defending myself was futile against this woman's cruelty. I need some air, I managed to choke out, pushing back from the table. I had to escape before breaking down completely. Marla scoffed as I rushed away. Running away again, are we? Typical. I hurried out to the back patio, gulping in the cool night air as burning tears streaked my cheeks. How could she be so hateful and demeaning toward me? Footsteps approached, and I tensed, steeling myself for another barrage of insults. But it was Evan, his face etched with sadness and apologetic. Lena, I'm so sorry, she was completely out of line back there, he said softly, taking my hand. You know how important you and the kids are to me. Don't listen to her vitriol. I pulled my hand away, suddenly angry at his passivity. But I did listen, Evan. For 8 years, I've listened to her constant put-downs and cruelty toward me, toward Zoe. When are you finally going to stand up to your mother? Evan's eyes widened, then quickly averted. You know how she is. She'll never change, he mumbled weakly. I felt something inside me harden at his words. For the first time, I truly saw Evan's inability, or unwillingness, to protect me from his mother's abuse. In that moment, the illusion of our marriage began cracking before my eyes. As I looked into my husband's beaten, submissive stance, I realized with sinking dread that this pattern would never end. Marla's iron grip over him was unbreakable, and I was the perpetual target for her destructive need to dominate. Warily, I turned and headed back inside, leaving Evan standing alone with his spineless excuses. I sensed this was the beginning of an inescapable downward spiral that would alter my family forever. If only I knew then just how devastating the consequences would be. The tension hung thick in the air as Marla smoothed her silk blouse, a self-satisfied smirk playing across her lips. Lena, dear, I have some news that may shake things up a bit. I eyed her warily from across the kitchen counter. What are you talking about? Well, you know how concerned I've been about securing a legitimate heir for my son, she began in a mock-sympathetic tone. A daughter is lovely, but it simply won't do for carrying on the family legacy. Rage simmered within me, but I bit my tongue. After the disastrous dinner weeks ago, I knew any protest would be futile against this woman's twisted agenda. Marla continued, so I took matters into my own hands to help solve this delicate issue. I introduced Evan to a wonderful young lady, Sienna. She's fertile, devoted, and more than capable of providing him with the son he deserves. The words hung in the air like a bad dream. But Marla's vindictive stare told me this was no nightmare. It was disgustingly real. You brought another woman into our marriage to have a baby with my husband? I sputtered, struggling to process this depths of her depravity. Oh, don't be so dramatic, she scoffed. I'm doing what's best for my son's future. You've proven quite incapable in that regard. The casual cruelty of her words struck me like physical blows. How could anyone be so utterly lacking in human empathy? You cruel, manipulative hag, I cried out, unable to contain my anger any longer. Does Evan even know about this vile scheme? A slow, satisfied smile spread across Marla's face. Why don't you ask him yourself, dear? On cue, Evan stepped into the room, flanked by a slim, overly made-up woman I didn't recognize. Sienna, I presumed. The look of sheepish contrition on my husband's face said it all. You allowed this? Your own mother brought another woman into our marriage to bear your child? I stammered, feeling the world crumbling around me. Evan couldn't meet my eyes. Lena, we've talked about how important carrying on the family line is. So you're just going to let your mother pimp out some cheap whore to get what she wants? I screamed, uncaring of the foul language as blinding rage took over. Sienna's eyebrows shot up in feigned indignation. Evan finally looked at me, his expression hardening to match his mother's callous demeanor. This is for the greater good, Lena. My duty as a man. If you were able to do your wifely duties properly, we wouldn't need to go to such extremes. His cold, rehearsed words lanced through my heart like daggers. This was really happening. My own husband was utterly betraying me in the most humiliating way possible, all with his mother's enthusiastic support. Marla chuckled at my stunned silence. Don't worry, dear. Once Sienna properly breeds, you can focus your energy on my granddaughter. We wouldn't want you feeling completely useless. Her words ignited an indescribable fury within me that I never knew I possessed. With a primal scream, I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy ceramic vase, and hurled it with every ounce of strength. It struck Marla squarely in her smug face, shattering viciously and spraying blood and ceramic shards across the room. Sienna shrieked in horror as Marla crumpled to the floor, clutching her ruined face and howling in agony. Chest heaving, I turned to Evan, seeing the shock and fear in his eyes. In that unrestrained moment, I knew my marriage had disintegrated into ashes. There would be no forgiving this ultimate betrayal. Marla's monstrous machinations had cut straight through the very core of my world. The only thing left was vengeance. The eerie silence hung heavy in the air as Marla's wails finally subsided. I stood motionless, fists clenched, glaring at the crumpled, bleeding form of my monstrous mother-in-law on the kitchen floor. Evan stared at me with a mixture of shock and fear. Beside him, Sienna shrank back, clearly shaken by my outburst, but still clinging to her role in this sick charade. You crazy bitch! Marla's trembling voice finally broke the tension, thick with a combination of pain and rage. I'll see you arrested for this. Assaulting me in my own home. Your home? I scoffed, unable to contain the sudden resurgence of fury rippling through me. This is my home, the home I made with my husband, the man you're trying to pimp out behind my back like some kind of degenerate mother-pimping monster. Marla opened her mouth to protest, but I cut her off with a raised hand. No, don't even try denying it, you hateful crone. I heard everything, how you willingly brought this woman into my marriage explicitly to cuckold your own son. I turned my fiery glare to Evan, who flinched as if struck. And you spineless coward, going along with your mother's demented plans, ready to stick your dick into the first fertile womb she picks for you. Lena, he began weakly, but I wasn't about to let him make pathetic excuses. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? That I'd just be a good little wifey while you knocked up some cheap hussy on the side? Hey! Sienna's shrill voice cut in, her fake-baked face contorting with indignation. I am not some hussy! Your bastard husband came on to me! I whirled on the overly made-up woman, feeling a cruel smile spread across my face. Did he now? So tell me, when you were spreading your legs for a very married man, did you stop to think about his innocent family you were helping to destroy? Sienna opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Deep down, even she realized how reprehensible her role was in this sordid scheme. Chuckling darkly, I turned back to Evan. Unfreaking believable. I gave you everything. A beautiful child, a loving home, an amazing life. And you were ready to just throw it all away to satisfy your mother's unhinged breeding fetish. Marla stirred, glaring up at me, her face already starting to grotesquely swell from the vase impact. You have no one to blame but yourself, you infertile. Enough, I roared, slamming my fist down on the counter, hard enough to make them all jump. I have had it with your bottomless well of cruelty and manipulation. If having a son is so obsessively important, then Evan is welcome to it. Striding over to a small desk, I snatched up a pen and a sheaf of papers, thrusting them toward Evan with cheeks burning. Separation agreement. You can have your son's situation, your freedom to breed some new little heirs with that plastic surgery disaster over there. Evan gaped, stunned into silence. Even Sienna seemed jolted by my actions as the gravity of the situation sank in. "Well?" I demanded through gritted teeth. "Sign it and get out! Take your vile, treacherous mother and your stupid son quest and just go. I want you out of my house, out of my life." Slowly, numbly, Evan took the pen and stared at the agreement. A heavy pause seemed to blanket the room as Marla and Sienna looked on with matching expressions, a mixture of surprise and sickening satisfaction. Then, with a trembling hand, Evan scrawled his name in harsh strokes across the papers, officially ending our marriage in that single callous gesture, as his mother had always intended. Exhaling hard, I snatched the signed pages back from his hand, our eyes locking in one last, searingly intense glare. Then I turned and walked upstairs without another word, clutching the proof of my broken world and wondering how I would ever be able to piece my shattered life back together. The next few days passed in a numb blur. Evan and his mother had stormed out after the confrontation, taking their co-conspirator Sienna with them. An eerie silence descended over the house I once thought of as my loving home. I drifted aimlessly, my mind struggling to process the devastating implosion of my marriage. Logically, I knew signing those separation papers was the only recourse after Evan's unforgivable betrayal. And yet, the overwhelming sense of loss threatened to swallow me whole at times. Zoe, our 8-year-old daughter, seemed to pick up on the heavy tension despite my efforts to shield her. She became quieter, clingier, her usual bright exuberance dimming. "Mommy, where did Daddy go?" she asked one evening as we picked at our dinner in silence. I froze, unprepared for the question. Part of me wanted to proclaim the ugly truth, that her father had abandoned us to chase some atavistic need to breed an heir with another woman. But I couldn't bring myself to shatter her innocence so completely. "Daddy had to go away for a little while, honey," I hedged, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Work things." Zoe frowned, clearly picking up on my emotional disquiet. Ever the empath, just like her mother. "Are you sad, Mommy? Did you and Daddy have a fight?" "Something like that, baby," I managed, fighting back the lump swelling in my throat. "But everything will be okay, I promise." The lie tasted like ashes on my tongue, because in that moment there was no way to see how anything could ever be okay again. A sharp knock at the door jolted me from my reverie. Zoe looked up, eyes wide with something like hope. "Is that Daddy?" "Stay here, sweetie," I said quickly, rising to answer the door with trepidation curling in my stomach. But it wasn't Evan on the other side. Instead, a sharply dressed man in an expensive suit stood with a crisp folder in his hands. "Mrs. Redding?" he asked brusquely without preamble. "I'm Mr. Collins, an associate of your husband's." An icy fist gripped my heart as I suddenly sensed where this was headed. The separation had clearly begun the legal fractures. "My firm has prepared these documents for you to review and sign," Mr. Collins continued, all business as he held out the folder. Hesitantly, I accepted the hefty stack of papers, dread settling like a cold stone in my gut. This was really happening, the death knell of my marriage after Evan's sickening betrayal. As I mechanically paged through the legalese, certain phrases jumped out in harsh simplicity. Petition for dissolution of marriage, rendered the covenant irreparably broken, division of assets favoring the male issue-bearing party. I felt the blood drain from my face as awful realization bloomed. This wasn't just a simple divorce agreement. It was Evan and his demonic mother wielding their wealth and influence to strip me of everything, my home, my life, my child, all in cruel pursuit of their deranged male heir vendetta. "You have 48 hours to review and sign these terms, Mrs. Redding," Mr. Collins stated flatly. "After that, my client will pursue more aggressive recourse if you fail to comply." The unmistakable threat laced his words like arsenic. Memories flashed of the unrestrained violence that ran in Marla's virulent veins, the vase, the bloodshed, of her unstoppable quest to destroy any obstacle to the grandchild she craved. My treacherous, spineless husband had clearly thrown in with his vile mother. He would stop at nothing to cut me out of his life completely, all for the unforgivable sin of bearing him a daughter instead of a son. A cold, dead feeling settled over me, the final vestige of our broken marriage crumbling to bitter ash. There would be no more tears, no more desperate pleas or self-delusions. I was truly and utterly alone now, except for my innocent little girl watching in sad confusion from the next room. the pure, bright spirit that was supposed to be my greatest joy, but in that stark moment she became my sole lifeline, my unbreakable reason to endure the coming storm. I turned to Mr. Collins, my jaw rigid. "Tell your client that after 48 hours he can expect to hear from my attorney," I stated in a toneless rasp, "because I'll be damned if I let him take my daughter too." With that, I shut the door in the lawyer's face. Then I turned and pulled a confused Zoe into my arms, holding her tiny form as if she were a life vest in a raging sea. There would be no surrender, no matter how viciously Evan and Marla tried to drown me. For Zoe's sake, I would find a way to stay afloat and make them pay dearly for their twisted sins. The next 48 hours were a blur of grim determination. I knew time was short before Evan and Marla would attempt to strip me of everything I held dear. First, I secured a shark of a divorce attorney, Caroline Weston. Steely, aggressive, and with a reputation for devouring entitled rich husbands like Evan. "This is one of the most blatant, unethical cases of alienation of affection I've ever seen," Caroline stated in a cold fury after I recounted the sordid details. "We're going to crucify this bastard and his Medea of a mother." Her words kindled a flame of hope that I could indeed survive this nightmare with my daughter and some shreds of dignity intact. Next was gathering ammunition, any proof of Evan's misdeeds that could be leveraged in the coming war. I pored over financial records, discovering his company had been filtering money to an offshore account for years. Embezzlement and tax evasion, potentially criminal behavior if exposed, perfect leverage. Finally, I arranged for Zoe's temporary relocation while the legal battle raged. My sister Nina, an elementary school teacher, lived 2 states over. I knew she could shelter and care for my sweet girl while I fought in the trenches. When the 48-hour deadline arrived, I was ready, or as ready as I could be. Mr. Collins arrived promptly with the same aloof disdain as before. "I trust you've had ample time to review the terms and come to an amenable decision," he stated flatly. In response, I slid the signed divorce petition across the table, but not the one he provided. The stack of papers bore Caroline Weston's imprimatur, every word thoroughly negotiated for maximum impact. Mr. Collins' eyes flashed with surprise as he scanned the unrecognized document, his brows knitting in disapproval. "This was not the agreement we discussed. My client will need to reevaluate these terms." "These are the terms," I stated coldly. "I refuse to be bullied or stonewalled. Every nefarious act, every awful betrayal has consequences." I slid the thick dossier of financial documentation across the table, watching Mr. Collins's face blanch slightly as he grasped the implications. "Your client's illegal corporate dealings have been rigorously catalogued by very credible forensic accountants," I added with a hint of vindictive satisfaction. "Any attempt to deprive me of my legal marital rights and claim over my daughter will be met with the full public revelation of these damning records." I allowed that threat to hang in the air. Evan's ego and insecurity about his business reputation were thinly veiled weak spots, traits his vile mother had eagerly exploited countless times. Now it was my turn to wield that leverage. Mr. Collins maintained an impressively impassive poker face as he studied the documentation, though a muscle twitched almost imperceptibly in his jaw. Perhaps he was already calculating how hard this battle could hit Evan's pocketbook. "I will present this counteroffer to Mr. Redding in full," he said finally, voice tight, "contingent on these materials remaining discreet for now." "See that you do," I said simply. "The meter is running on flaying his reputation and criminal liability wide open." With a curt nod, Mr. Collins collected the documents and departed, clearly reeling from this unanticipated turn of events. For the first time in a long time, I felt the faintest spark of hope, of reclaiming some portion of my life and dignity from Evan and Marla's grasping claws. But there was still one vital loose end to secure before the war began in earnest. I turned and gathered Zoe into my arms, fighting back fresh tears at her sad, bewildered expression. "Mommy," she said tremulously, "what's happening? I want Daddy to come home." I hushed her gently, stroking her soft hair. "I know, baby, I know, but you have to go stay with Auntie Nina for a little while, okay? For your safety." Zoe's eyes widened slightly, picking up on the undercurrent of tension. But she nodded obediently. As I clutched her tiny form, I silently vowed to do whatever it took to protect my daughter's well-being, even inscribing her name permanently in the chasm dividing our family. There would be hurt and confusion, but I hoped she would eventually understand, because in the end, I would make absolutely certain that Evan and Marla paid the ultimate price for their monstrous transgressions. Once that line was crossed, there was no going back. The divorce battle erupted with a fury I could scarcely have imagined. Evan and Marla clearly felt spurned by my refusal to capitulate, and were determined to crush me through overwhelming legal force and intimidation. Caroline proved to be worth every penny, matching their team's viciousness tit for tat. Accusations and exposures flew in both directions as dark secrets were mercilessly excavated. Marla launched a public smear campaign, portraying me as an unfit mother and spouse jealous of Evan's business success. We countered by leaking details of her deranged campaign to cuckold her own son for a male heir. It was a brutal, soul-destroying process. But I refused to surrender an inch, kept afloat by my determination to maintain stability for Zoe. Finally, after 6 excruciating months, cooler heads in Evan's camp prevailed in pushing for a negotiated settlement, an end to the scorched earth hostilities before any more radioactive scandals fully combusted. I'll never forget the heavy silence that fell over the sterile conference room as our respective legal teams arrived. Evan entered, shoulders squared but eyes hollowed by the long battle. Then Marla swept in, her face still bearing the faintest scars from the vase incident, twisted into her trademark sneer. I felt a brief thrill of satisfaction that at least I'd managed to mar her unbearably smug exterior. Greetings were dispensed with, having long abandoned such niceties. We came straight to business. My client is prepared to offer a full and impartial distribution of legitimate marital assets, provided certain conditions are met, Caroline stated firmly, including permanent renunciation of custodial claims over the minor child. I could feel Marla's glare burning a hole through me. Sacrificing any claim to Zoe was the heaviest concession, but a necessary one to secure safety and healing. To her credit, Caroline didn't flinch, as well as assurances that the unconventional reproductive circumstances during the marriage remain sealed and undisclosed. A harsh jab at the twisted heir conspiracy, and a not-so-veiled threat about potential criminal repercussions. Evan shifted uncomfortably at the allusion. Marla's scowl deepened. While such terms are highly irregular, their lead counsel replied stiffly, we are amenable to the equity distribution, provided indemnity against future potential actions. A ugly pause lingered. They knew their financial skullduggery had been thoroughly exposed and could jeopardize not just Evan's business, but potential imprisonment. So they had no choice but to negotiate a suppression of the whole sordid truth. The tables had finally turned in my favor. Of course, so long as commitments are adhered to, the matters will remain permanently sealed, Caroline stated, her shark-like smile just a touch too wide. The negotiation continued for hours, splitting immense assets and investments down to the finest decimal point. But in the end, we hammered out an agreement, secured by both sides of mutual sustaining silence. Marla looked utterly miserable, faced with irrevocably surrendering control over her son's life and Zoe's. While still obscenely wealthy, I knew the concessions represented a profound personal defeat, which fueled my resolve. I don't expect congratulations, Caroline told me in an undertone as the final paperwork was prepared. This whole situation is equal parts sickening and infuriating, but you stood your ground and secured the best path for your daughter's well-being. I could only nod numbly, my strength finally waning after the marathon ordeal. There was no jubilation or catharsis, only the cold satisfaction of having survived this battle, of inflicting some semblance of consequences on Evan and Marla for their grotesque transgressions, and ensuring a future of stability for Zoe. Sliding the notarized agreement across the desk, I met Marla's seething glare one last time. Don't ever set foot near me or my daughter again, you twisted, evil bitch. Too weary even to revel in her impotent sputtering at the insult, I simply stood and walked out, gathering the last remnants of my dignity to forge a path into this new, uncertain life. There was still one final loose end to tie up, and I intended to cut Marla's last thread of delusion with utmost precision. With the divorce settlement finalized and my financial future secured, I could finally turn my focus to rebuilding my life, our life, free from Evan and Marla's toxic orbit. My first priority was reintegrating with Zoe. The poor girl had been shuttled between relatives for months, kept at a cautious distance from the legal war zone raging between her parents. I could only imagine the confusion and hurt she must have felt. When Nina brought her home that first day, Zoe ran straight into my arms, her little body trembling with soft sobs. My heart shattered anew at her muffled cries. "I missed you so much, Mommy. I was so scared." "Shh, I know, baby," I soothed, fighting my own tears. "I missed you more than you could ever know, but it's okay now. We're going to be okay." She pulled back, her young face still so innocent yet bearing a new heaviness. "Is Daddy ever coming home?" A lump formed in my throat as I studied her deep brown eyes, so much like Evan's. How could I lie, yet also deprive her of hope? "Daddy can't be with us anymore, sweetheart," I managed carefully. "He made some choices that went against what we believe is right." Zoe's brow furrowed in confusion. "Did he do something bad?" "In a way, yes." I sighed, pulling her close again. "But you don't have to worry about any of that now. What matters is you and me and how we move forward from here, okay?" She nodded, seeming to grasp the simplicity of that concept, despite the complexities raging underneath. In that moment, I vowed to preserve her innocence, her trust, in whatever way I could. Over the following weeks, we began to rebuild our little family of two. With Evan's financial settlement, I was able to secure a fresh start, a cozy rental home away from the shattered remnants of our marriage, enroll Zoe in a new school, and realign my career trajectory in marketing communications. Slowly, smiles and warmth began returning to Zoe's youthful exuberance as our new normal solidified, no longer weighed down by that toxic undercurrent of dysfunction surrounding Evan and Marla. The only hiccup came when I received a terse communication from Sienna, Evan's former mistress, the woman he had intended to breed his heir with. "Your pathetic excuse for a husband came crawling back, in case you were wondering," her message read acidly. "But once I got a taste of his true self and that monster-in-law, I wanted no part of that dysfunctional freak show." She included documentation showing the exorbitant settlement she had demanded to preserve her silence and disappear from our lives for good. A final insult to injury, paid from my share of the divorce payout. Rather than anger, I felt only pity for Sienna's sad delusion that she'd been anything more than a dispensable pawn in Evan and Marla's twisted schemes, and I sensed her message held far more impact for them than for me. The ultimate failure and rejection of their disastrous heir-breeding plot. In a strange way, it felt like the last fading embers of that ugliness had finally burnt out completely, freeing me to turn my energy fully toward nurturing and protecting the family I did have, my ethereal bond with Zoe. There were still the occasional flare-ups from Marla's camp, grotesque tantrums lamenting her loss of control and grandchild, but I simply systemized blocking and containing her, preserving peace for Zoe at all costs. A few months after the finalized settlement, I received an awkward, rambling text from Evan out of the blue. "I know I have no right to darken your life any longer. The wreckage left behind is entirely my shame to bear. But I hope one day Zoe will understand that, despite everything, I did love her with all my heart." The words were a hollow echo, a desperate grasp for validation or absolution after his spinelessness shattered our family. I didn't bother responding, focused entirely on my new beginning, because that broken man's sad plea for sympathy couldn't reach me any longer. Not in the sanctuary of tranquility and love I had rebuilt around my beautiful daughter. Not when his vile deeds had finally caught up to him, leaving him utterly alone with his unbearable guilt. The years passed with surprising tranquility as I raised Zoe in our new peaceful life. There were moments of struggle and heartache, of course, but they paled in comparison to the constant toxicity that pervaded my marriage to Evan. As she grew into a brilliant, self-assured young woman, I made sure Zoe understood the basic truths of what tore our family apart, at least enough for her to recognize the inherent brokenness in her father and grandmother's value system. She never voiced resentment toward them, but a sort of detached pity. An intrinsic understanding of how their obsessive pursuit of an heir destroyed any possible bond. "I'm just glad I had you, Mom," she would say with a maturity beyond her years. You were the only one who really knew what was important. Family, not bloodlines. Her words simultaneously filled me with pride and profound sadness for the innocence she was forced to let wither at such a young age. But I took solace in knowing I had insulated her from the brunt of their viciousness. Until the day that seismic postscript arrived, brutally textured with karma's fury. It was a simple certified letter that appeared innocuous at first glance. But the return address, a maximum security prison, quickly turned my blood cold. With hands trembling, I tore it open to find a terse, stark message. Mrs. Redding, I regret to inform you that your former husband, Evan Redding, has been incarcerated on charges of corporate racketeering, embezzlement, and tax evasion related to his business activities. The legalese continued, but my vision blurred as the full weight landed. Evan was going to prison for upwards of a decade, his career and reputation utterly immolated in the wake of those charges. Just like I had threatened all those years ago with my hidden evidence, a thermonuclear strike I'd hoped would never truly be detonated. Clearly, authorities had dug deeper in the aftermath of our brutal divorce and uncovered the full crater of his financial chicanery. The sick twist of satisfaction I felt soured in an instant, replaced by a mix of stunned dismay and something worse, something deeper. Remorse and empathy I didn't want to feel for that wretched man. Because no matter how unforgivable his actions, no matter how much he deserved punishment, I knew this development would utterly shatter Marla. Her whole world, her whole cancerous obsession for continuing the family empire through a male heir, would finally collapse in on itself with Evan incarcerated. She would be alone, bereft, her manipulative power machinations reduced to ashes at last. I tried to stamp out the small tendril of compassion worming through me, reminding myself of her boundless cruelty, her eagerness to obliterate my own family. Yet it persisted, the ghost of the hopeful young bride I had once been, sickened by the realization that Marla had doomed herself and her deepest desire through her very quest to obtain it. Her worldview had been her undoing. The ramifications, of course, would ripple out in unpredictable waves. What would become of their real estate empire and wealth with Evan behind bars? And more urgently, what about Zoe? I was deep in thought, rereading the letter for any clues, when the front door opened and my now-grown daughter swept in from classes. "Hi, Mom. Did you hear from—" She stopped short, taking in my pale, shaken expression. "Mom, what is it? What's wrong?" Drawing a steadying breath, I wordlessly handed her the letter. Zoe's eyes rapidly scanned the contents, her brows shooting upward in disbelief. "Oh my God, Dad's in prison?" She looked up at me, the shock and hurt palpable despite our long estrangement from Evan. I moved to pull her into a comforting embrace, stroking her hair just like when she was little. "I know, honey, I know. It's a lot to process." She held me tightly for a long moment, and I could sense her whirling thoughts settling like sediment through cloudy waters. Finally, she pulled back, eyes resolute and voice steady. "This doesn't change anything for us, Mom. His mistakes, his crimes, that's on him. We've built a good life beyond his mistakes and grandmother's madness." Zoe squeezed my hands firmly, her warm smile crackling with that resilient spirit inherited from her mother's DNA. Maybe this can be the end of it all, a fresh start, free from his shadow and her poison for good. I gazed at her with swelling pride and love, overcome by the wise perseverance blazing in her youthful eyes. She was right. As the monolithic shockwave propagated outward, Evan behind bars, Marla's world crumbling, we stood together on solid ground, free and unshaken. Perhaps this was the final cosmic realignment, setting the scales permanently even. Pulling my brave, beautiful daughter close, I felt the manacles of that dark family history begin to shed like snakeskin at last. Evan and Marla had bet everything on lies and power lust, unwittingly burrowing their shared grave. But in their defeat, in their self-ruination, I had conquered. My quiet resilience, my bond of love with Zoe had won the generational war. My only lingering words as their entitled kingdom crumbled to dust were the same ones I had snarled at Marla so many years ago. "Don't ever set foot near me or my daughter again, because this time it would be permanent."